The woman who was at the well and telling Jesus that they used to worship in the mountain, and we finished up with that important verse, John chapter 4, verse 24. God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And this is the first of the teaching that Jesus had about this different concept of eating and drinking. Remember there, it was a matter of being thirsty and needing water at the well. She says, you don't even have anything to pull water with. And he started talking with her about living water. And then in today's lesson, we're going to learn more about him talking about the kind of thing we have to eat, what's really important. Just like he was telling her, you have to drink the living water where you'll never thirst again. And then people really got offended when he started talking about different concept of eating a little bit later on. But Jesus uses this term, or when John writes of Jesus' words, he uses this term in King James, verily, verily. Newer translations may say truly, truly. But every time it's used, and in fact, looking at Guy and Wood's commentary, he says that in John's biography, that's what he always calls the Gospel of John, in John's biography, that this term, verily, verily, is used 25 times. So it's almost like when you get if you're lucky, you get a college professor that'll stomp his foot or something when it's going to be something you better take a note on, and you'll probably see it on the test. It's almost like that with Jesus, something that's going to be really important. You better take note of this. He would say, verily, verily. And so he said it about 3 times talking with Nicodemus. When he told Nicodemus, you got to be born again. And so Nicodemus didn't understand at first, and he tried to explain it to him, and then verily, verily, he says again, like I said, 2 more times. So that's a very important thing for us to understand, that when we read John, if in the King James you see verily, verily, some of the other translations, truly, truly, Jesus is saying this is an important point. John called the miracles, what other places call miracles, he called them signs, these signs that Jesus did. And in fact, yes, sir. No, that's good.
Jesus seems to say everything to make you think what he's saying.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Everything he says is like, what?
To make you think. And in fact, and John's the one that can really point this out, he really utilizes people's misunderstanding. It's almost as if when he first says it, he wants you to misunderstand. I'm not saying that he wants you to misunderstand to your detriment, but Nicodemus says, how can you enter your mother's womb again and be born? He's throwing something out there for you to ask a question. And you'll see it several times. There's a misunderstanding corrected. To jump ahead toward the end of today's lesson, I hope we get to this, the healing, with bringing Lazarus back to life. Jesus is with his disciples, and he tells them that Lazarus is sick, but then they wait about 2 more days where they are. They hang around for about 2 days, and they're wondering about Lazarus, and he says, well, Lazarus is sleeping. Oh, that's good. We all know that's good. If somebody's sick, that's good that he's sleeping. And Jesus said, I will wake him back up. And he realized that they did not realize what he was saying. And it says, Jesus said plainly, Lazarus is dead. And so you see what I'm saying? Sometimes it takes a while to get that through. And I think that's kind of a teaching technique, really.
I think, too, that teaching technique is that he knows that a majority of mankind is going to misinterpret it, maybe, or not understand it at first.
Good point.
So he's showing them, giving you the solution before you realize there's a problem.
Right, right. It's not just the 12 that's with him, but this is the way people are going to be in general, is not understand this concept. What we didn't get a chance to mention, it's an important point, especially since really John doesn't cover as many miracles as some of the other Gospels. This healing of the nobleman's son, and the thing that I think is really interesting about that, I don't think, what this teaches me is it's okay to question. It's okay to say, I want to make sure this is really what it seems to be. So the nobleman believed, and Jesus said, your son is well. And he noticed what time it was when he said that. Because when the nobleman gets back home, and of course he's rejoicing that his son is well, notice what it says in verse 52 of John 4. He inquired, what hour did my son's fever get lifted? See how specific that gets. And they said, it took him a while to travel back. And they told him what hour it was yesterday at this hour. And that way he knew for sure that it was right when Jesus said, your son's well. I don't think it's bad that he questioned that. It probably made his faith stronger that he found it was the exact hour that Jesus said, your son's well. John chapter 5, Guy and Wood says, contains the second sermon. And remember, that first sermon is with Nicodemus. Nicodemus, in trying to help him understanding about the second birth, Jesus actually has kind of a small sermon there that as we read it. And so as we read John, there's another long passage that Jesus explains, and that's when he heals a lame man on the Sabbath. That's what causes this sermon to take place, because here in John chapter 5 is the first of two times that the Pharisees are complaining that he's working on the Sabbath because he healed a man. And so we're going to compare later on the same kind of reasoning the Pharisees use in John chapter 5 and John chapter 9. But if you look at John chapter 6, or maybe it's 5 verse 18, we've got the fact that his brothers are, it seemed like, in this case, it seemed like his brothers are laying a trap. I think this occurred after Jesus walked on the sea. We talked about miracles that are recorded in the other ones. There's only two miraculous events that are recorded by all four Gospels. And one of them is Jesus on resurrection. It's obvious why the Gospels would include the resurrection. That's the major event. But other than the resurrection of Jesus from the grave, the only other event that all four talk about is when he walked on the sea. And that's probably why the reason is whenever people are just talking about, oh, you can do miracles, like can you walk on water? But they left and started going across, the disciples started going across, and John gets into the specifics. They'd gotten about the distance, if you translate, about 2 or 3 miles away. And that's rowing. And then Jesus comes walking on the water. Kind of makes me wonder whether he walked fast or whether the Lord kind of transferred him part of that way. He wasn't too far behind him when he started walking. You may wonder why I bring that up, but a little later on we'll come up with that concept again, that Jesus seems to, at least after his resurrection, we can see for sure when they're locked in the upper room and he appears in the upper room. But just trying to think about that night and the fact that they're rowing, and then Jesus just comes walking up alongside them, 3 or 4 miles out in the water. The other thing, I think I was talking it over with Robbie when he said, and notice also, as soon as he gets in the boat, they're at their destination. They didn't have a long time after that. Once Jesus got up with them, they were where they were going. But it's when what I wanted to bring up about his brothers, it's actually in chapter 7 verse 18. And I had it a little bit earlier, but what they said to him, they said, why don't you go down to this Feast of the Tabernacle and kind of show what show your signs down there. I thought we'd better list who these half-brothers are. They shared a mother in Mary. Of course, Joseph was their father. And their names were James, Joseph, and you notice in today's sermon, right when we introduced Barnabas, his name was Joseph, whose surname was Barnabas. There was one of Jesus' half-brothers was Simon, and he had a half-brother named Judas. So Sherry was asking earlier, we actually were talking about the name Mary. There's a lot of names that were popular back then. John was a popular name. Mary was a popular name for women. But Judas was apparently fairly popular because not only was he a half-brother of Jesus, but one of the apostles, his father was Judas. So there's three Judases right there. Judas, the half-brother of Jesus, Judas, the father, and I can't remember which apostle it was, and then Judas, the betrayer, Judas Iscariot, I call him. But these four guys were told that even they did not believe that Jesus was who he said he was. So starting in chapter 7, after these things Jesus walked in Galilee, for he did not want to walk in Judea, because the Jews sought to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of tabernacles was at hand, and his brothers therefore said to him, Depart from here and go to Judea, that your disciples may also see the works that you're doing. For no one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. And then that statement, for even his brothers did not believe in him. And I never thought about it, and it was actually Don Blackwell that brought it up. He was talking about how strongly James's conversion was, how much he repented, and how different a person he was. But James is perhaps the oldest of Jesus' half-brothers, the way they're listed. And they didn't believe he was the Son of God. And they said, why don't you go down to Jerusalem and do some of these?
Trying to get him killed, wasn't it?
That's what Don Blackwell seems to think, is they were trying to get him killed. Now that's very much like, we talk about the similarity with Jesus and Joseph, but that was the relationship at first. Like, who does this guy think he is, you know? And Jesus knew that it was bad news to get down that way, so he avoided it. But the sermon that I first started thinking about this with James, if you look at what an important, he's referred to as a pillar in the church. He was an elder at the church in Jerusalem. Of course, he wrote the book of James, but that was really a conversion. Not only did he begin to believe that a guy that he grew up with was the Son of God, but he believed it so firmly that he just did many wonderful things, and was an elder in the church in Jerusalem and wrote the book of James.
He knew that they were his half-brother.
Half-brother, yeah.
How's that?
Well, you know who Jesus' father was?
Yeah.
The Holy Spirit. These guys didn't have the Holy Spirit for a father, but they did have Mary for a mother. Joseph was their father.
You're talking about, okay, I see.
Joseph was their father.
Yeah, Joseph's father.
So they shared Mary in common. In fact, I guess if you...
But Joseph wasn't father of Jesus.
No,
Actually.
no. And in fact, you know, when you start looking at the genealogy, it's interesting that some of them want to transfer it through Joseph, but he wasn't his real father. To me, the genealogy that works better is the one that goes through Mary, you know, because that's his flesh and blood.
I researched that when I was studying, and the legal genealogy, according to the Jews, would have gone through the father.
Right. That's why they do it
The blood goes through Mary. That's why that's why.
both ways.
Yes. And I thought that was interesting. I always wondered, well, why would you just go with blood? But
Yeah.
would go with the down the
They really had to have the who's your daddy. Right.
And it must have been frustrating for Jesus to say, okay, this is the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they were like walking on water, for example, this is what I can do to go farther above and give you this opportunity
Right.
to show you.
And John makes it very clear that, in fact, at one point Jesus says, if you're not believing the words that I'm telling you, that me and the Father are one, then look at the signs. can't you believe the signs? And they started asking, just like the nobleman asked, what time did my son get well? There were people that were over there waiting to see what happens because Jesus didn't leave with his disciples, and there he is. And so they started asking, what time did you guys leave? To row across, and they were checking it out. So I asked the question there, and about the third one down, did Jesus want his half-brothers wanted him killed? And it seemed like that's the case. I say that John chapter 8 begins at the Mount of Olives, and the reason that's interesting to me is, of course, that's the place where the Garden of Gethsemane was. Apparently, Jesus retreated. We talk about going on a retreat. Apparently, he went to the Mount of Olives quite often, and it's a place of beauty. But look at what John chapter 8 gets into. He comes back from the Mount of Olives, and they've drugged this woman out there in public, said she was caught in the very act of adultery. The obvious question comes up, what about the guy? Where's he? But they've got the woman there. And they said, Moses' law says that we should stone her to death. Not only is John the only one that records this, but it's got that curious part about writing in the dirt. I'm sure you've all heard speculation. What did Jesus write? Anybody heard a suggestion he was writing names? What if among the group there were some men that had also committed adultery with this woman? Chances are, if she was a loose woman, it wasn't just one man. What if he'd written some of the men's names down there? We don't know. But it's important enough that when Jesus rises up and makes the statement, let him who is without sin cast the first stone, and then they all start slowly trickling away and leaving. It says he stooped back down and started writing again. So that, whether you want to call it a teaching technique or whatever, that's really interesting how he acted preoccupied while they thought about what it is they were doing. And so that when he rises back up after writing in the dirt the second time, apparently it's just the woman there, and she says, "Woman, where are your accusers?" And she said, "There are none." He says, "Neither do I accuse you." But he also said, "Go and sin no more. Neither do I condemn thee, go and sin no more." John 8, verse 11, the second part of that verse. Then I've got the statement here that all of chapter 9 revolves around the sixth sign. There's only 7 signs that John talks about, and this is the 6th one, and it's the healing of the man that's born blind. And I've spent a lot of time with this. Last night I was talking with Robbie about it, and he said, "Do you have time to listen to the whole sermon?" I said, "Yes, I do." Sure enough, I listened to it twice. This was a big deal, this healing of the blind man, because there are other miracles where whatever was wrong with the person was not from birth. He was born blind. Even Helen Keller, she's very famous. But Helen Keller had sight till she was about 2 or 3 years old. She had some bad fever, and she lost her sight and her hearing, but she could remember even as a child, bright lights and trees and things like that. This man never had any memory of seeing. And when they started questioning about the miracle, they asked his parents. Parents said, "No, he's been blind ever since he was born." But his parents, you were right when you said why they wouldn't answer. It's specified right there in John. They were afraid of the Pharisees that put him out of the synagogue if they said that Jesus made him well. So what they said was, "This guy's of age, ask him. He's old enough to tell you what happened." And of course, Jesus, here again, it's almost like that writing in the dirt. Jesus spat in the dirt and made some, we'd call it mud, they call it clay, and put that on his eyes. And that was a matter of faith. If you can't even see and he's got this stuff on his eyes, and he's supposed to make his way over to the pool of Siloam and wash. And when he washed his eyes, he could see. And that's what he told. He told exactly what happened. Later on, they come back, after talking to his parents, they come back over him. They said, now what's the deal here? Tell us what happened. If you're watching a police procedural show, they'll say, "Okay, from the top. Where were you on this night?" And you go through it again. Well, to me, it seems almost smart aleck. He says, "Okay, I'll go through this again. Are you asking because you want to be his disciples?" They got really angry when he said that. They, no, we're followers of Moses. We don't want to follow this guy. You know? But he went through it again, and he told them exactly what happened step by step. And they said, this man, talking about Jesus, this man is a sinner. And this is a very powerful statement, verse 25, where John chapter 9, verse 25, he says, whether or not he's a sinner, I can't say. But all I can say is, I was blind, and now I see. Boy, that's a powerful statement, isn't it? How can you argue with that? They couldn't say that didn't happen.
In verse 16, when they couldn't deny what happened, then they said, well, he did it on the Sabbath, so he's not from God.
Right, right.
He did it, we can't deny that, but not from God.
So that's,
Out there he healed on the Sabbath.
so in this sermon, the guy actually had a chart. I was going to refer to it. And that's the similarities between this healing and the one in 5 with the lame man. You know, he said, take up thy bed and walk. You can't do something like that on the Sabbath. So the preacher was talking about the similarities between the miracle in John 5, the lame man, and here the blind man in chapter, that was chapter 5, and the blind man in chapter 9. They're both at pools. The first one was the pool of Bethsaida, I get them confused. We got a naval hospital, Bethsaida was a pool. And then in the 9th chapter here, the pool is Siloam. Sherry, whenever we go through that little Georgia town, I said they must have named it after the pool of Siloam. It's a tiny little town. They were both done on the Sabbath, and that's what they were accused him of. John chapter 5, verse 9, and John chapter 9, verse 14, just like you said, hey, he did this on the Sabbath. And in both cases, it wasn't a real cut and dried situation. I always like to look at the one with the weathered hand, and John doesn't mention that, but we've all seen people that if they can't use their hand, Jesus says, stretch forth the hand, stretch it forth, and it's perfect. But in these cases, a man had to take up his bed and walk. And this complication of he put mud on his eyes and he went and washed it off. So there was a complicated situation. And therefore, the conclusion is that they were unconventional kind of healings, ones that really got people's attention. So that brings us down to Jesus describing himself in chapter 10 as the Good Shepherd. And I've learned from preachers, especially ones that have been over there, we talk about a sheepfold, and they claim that there's no elaborate gate or anything on a sheepfold. They've got the walls around it, but that the shepherd is the door, that he's there to care after the sheep, and he gets, if he's going to get some sleep, he lays right in the passageway to come in and out of the sheepfold, and if they're trying to get out, they have to come over him. And of course, he's there if the wolf comes too. And Jesus contrasts the fact that if a guy's just a hireling and not the actual shepherd of the sheep, then when the wolf comes, he leaves. So that also sounds like there's not a real door there. If a guy looked up in the doorway and he sees a wolf coming and says, I'm out of here. And he leaves the sheep for the wolves. But Jesus is the good shepherd, and he stresses that he is the way. And that's really what we get from John chapter 10. We have a lot of people in the religious world today say, well, we're all going to the same place. We've just got different ways to get there. There's one way. And Jesus said he was the way, that he's the door to this safe sheepfold. I am the door, he kept stressing. So when we go to John 11, we already talked about that a little bit, that he was telling his disciples that they have to get back. Let's talk a little bit about this relationship he had with Martha, Mary. We think Martha was older. Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. Good friends, right? Remember when we read earlier that they said Bethany beyond Jordan? They were trying to make that separate because Jesus would go to Bethany to visit, and that's where the home of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus was. And so there was a Bethany earlier in John, Bethany beyond Jordan, and this Bethany was near to Jerusalem, just a little bit east of Jerusalem. But Jesus was quite a ways away because they had to travel to get back. When he got there, I think that the sisters had been anxiously awaiting, because each one of them, Martha told him, if you had been here, Lazarus wouldn't have died. Mary said the same thing. Jesus knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He asked him to show the place where they laid him, and they were taking him to the tomb. He wanted the stone rolled away, and to show you how realistic this is, you know, we use that King James, Lord, he's 4 days, he stinketh. Very, very plain language, you know, that I don't think you're going to like the smell. But when the people saw Jesus going to the tomb, and he saw all the mourners, apparently there was a lot of people not only sorry about Lazarus' death, but sorrowing with the sisters who were sorrowful. And Jesus wept. The shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept, and that's there because of his compassion. He had empathy for the people who were sorrowing with the sisters. And he told the disciples that the reason that he was going to wait is for the ability to perform this sign that people would believe that he was the Son of God. And people saw the sign and took great notice of it, because we'll learn that this begins the real effort by the Pharisees that ended up in killing Jesus. This is the beginning of the end, the raising of Lazarus. It says, as we get into chapter 12, is where we make our transition for next week. But they are so angry and so upset. One of their plans, what are we going to do about this? This is such a big miracle, and so many people saw it, and the guy comes out of the grave and raised from the dead. One of the plans is, I tell you what, let's kill Lazarus. And that strikes me a little bit strange. Who's not going to know that he was alive and then somebody murdered him or whatever? But they thought, well, if he's not walking around here alive, at least we don't have to deal with it, right? Can anybody think of any other reason that was part of their plot? Look at John chapter 12. Actually, it's right before 12, right at the end of 11. 11 verse 49, Caiaphas being a high priest that year is reasoning about their plan to kill Jesus. It's only fitting that one man should die for the people, and that not that they'd lose the whole nation. How was it that they were going to lose the nation? They were concerned about the fact that they were under a governorship of Rome, and that if they didn't keep things under their own control, they felt like that Rome would, what'd you say? Oh, they were evil. But they wanted to stay in power and tell Rome that they were the ones in power. Verse 11, verse 53 of chapter 11 says, then from that day on they plotted to put him to death. Jesus went and hid out in a little city called Ephraim, and I couldn't find it on any of my maps, so it bugged me. I kept researching, and it's northeast. It's kind of on a triangle between Bethel. You remember in the Old Testament they set up an altar at Bethel, and Jericho. So everybody knows Jericho's off to the east. To the northeast is this town called Ephraim, where Jesus hid out for a while. That's where I was.
Many of the Jews went away and believed in Jesus. It shows to what ridiculous measures they would go to. Here's a man that was dead and is now alive. Let's kill him again, because if we don't, people are going to follow this Jesus.
They're going to see him alive, and out of sight, out of mind, maybe. If he's
They not think for a second Jesus might bring him back
again, yeah. But they really had a problem on their hands, and they really plotted to kill him. So when we start off, right, and I was trying to find it right next to where they were plotting Jesus' death. Like, not only were they going to kill Jesus, they're going to kill Lazarus too, but you have to find that there, like I said, in chapter 12, was it verse 10 you said?
Yeah, verse 10 and 11.
Mm-hmm. Steve, I wanted you to make a comment, and we'll begin here next week. When it's time for Jesus to leave Ephraim and to come into Jerusalem, and he had a big following. A lot of people wanted to see Jesus after this raising of Lazarus. And they cut branches from the trees and spread them in the way. I grew up watching Roy Rogers and Trigger, and even movie before that, movie Ivanhoe, the guy had a trusty steed, and I thought, donkey? I was looking at it from these American Western standpoint. Why don't you have a nice stallion, a horse, you know? But I want you to tell us a little bit about donkeys. And apparently a lot of the royalty rode donkeys. And there's good reason from talking with you.
Donkeys are, most people don't know, they're much smarter than horses are. So they're not a flight animal.
Right.
So if something startles them or scares them, they usually stop and just look at it and decide whether it's something you can deal with.
Have that big crowd of people throwing. Think of some horses if you're throwing a big palm leaf down in front of him. You know? Right. Gary, you had something to say about it?
As we go through the Bible here, we see that there's a lot of people see these miracles that Jesus is doing, but they're wanting to kill him.
Mm-hmm.
But God, it was a time for him to die, so Jesus was protected. Like you said, he went from one place to the other. It just wasn't time for him to sacrifice his life at that time.
Right. And he told his apostles, he kept saying, it's not my time, but he told them, now I'm going to be going to Jerusalem. I'm going to be delivered up and tried. And that's when the big talk by Peter. Sure. Okay.
Were there two Marys that put expensive oil?
No, only one, and that's not a fly. That keeps me from skipping something that I needed to say. This same household, and where I got into reading about it, Sherry, was they were talking about apparently Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were fairly wealthy. They had a nice home. Apparently they had their own tomb right near their house, a garden with a tomb. And they had an expensive box of spikenard, it said. So that when she broke this alabaster box, it didn't have a cap on it. She had to break the box open and anoint Jesus' feet. And she washed his feet with her hair. That's all Mary, Martha's sister. So when Martha's in there preparing food, she says, Lord, I'm in here working by myself. Would you please get Mary to help me out? Now that's who we're talking about. Now, the thing is, there were a lot of Marys. Next week, just like I started off with the list of the apostles this week, we're out of time, but we'll talk about the 5 Marys in the New Testament. I've got them written down here, but it'll take a minute so you remember the one that's this and the one that's that. And people are wanting to make, in the modern thing, they want to make Mary Magdalene everybody, but she was a fairly minor character. She had 7 demons. Jesus cast out 7 demons out of Mary Magdalene. But there's 4 other Marys in the New Testament. We'll start there next week.